My name is Kayla Chorley, and I use the pronouns she, her, and I'm a Canadian certified counselor and counseling therapist from Edmonton, Alberta. I own my own private practice called Pineapple Therapy, and it specializes in the area of anxiety. So I work with a lot of adolescent and young adult clients, just like yourself, who may be watching this video. And this is why I'm really excited to talk about anxiety as a topic, because I think it is something that we need to understand a bit more. It's totally a buzzword right now, and a lot of us use it in our day-to-day language. So I think it's helpful to understand what we mean when we're saying that. In terms of my experience, I've worked in a school system prior to becoming a counselor. So I've worked extensively in the classroom as well as in the counseling setting with anxiety and how it might show up. And as well, I have my own personal experience with anxiety that has led me sort of on this path of supporting others who also experience anxiety.
Thank you very much, Kayla, for that. I appreciate you joining us on this show today. Like our viewers would benefit from a lot of the conversation we're going to have. And if we can help somebody, one person, I'm happy about it. You know?
Me too. I'm excited. Thank you for having me.
For sure. So today we're here to talk about anxiety. And I hear you're the expert on that.
I am. You know what? The fun part about this is even preparing for this today, I noticed my own anxiety show up. It was like, What if you say the wrong thing? Or what if you don't know the answer to the question? So I just decided to bring my anxiety with me today. So yeah, I would say a little bit of an expert on it because I deal with it myself.
Yeah. I mean, I can't say I knew exactly what anxiety was in the past. But throughout all the people starting to talk about it, I feel like we all suffer from some sort of anxiety at some levels, right?
Yes.
So it all depends on what kind of person you are and how you deal with it, I feel.
100%. Yep, you got that right. We're all humans and will experience anxiety on some level.
Absolutely. So from you to me, how would you describe what anxiety really is? What would you attribute it to?
Yeah, that's a great question. A good place to start. I think for a lot of us, anxiety feels scary because we actually don't know what it is. So if we can define it and we can put words to it, it takes away some of that fear. So at its very simplest level, anxiety is an emotion, just like joy, sadness, anger. And for a lot of us, it's interesting because we don't fear those things, but for some reason we give anxiety a really bad rap. It's got kind of this connotation that comes with it for most of us that feels really uncomfortable. And it brings with it quite an uncomfortable experience. But if we had to define it, really anxiety is worry about the future. So something that's going to happen that's future based. Often it shows up like what ifs. So as I said, just previously preparing for today, my own anxiety showed up as like, what if you don't know the answer? Or what if, you say something wrong? Or what if your hair looks funny? All these what ifs, right?
The lighting has to be perfect.
Yeah, exactly. So anxiety loves the what ifs and it loves uncertainty. So it likes to thrive on those things. It can take an uncertain event and it can say, well, let's come up with all the what if scenarios, all the possible negative things that can happen. And again, this is why it gets such a bad rap, because it is a really uncomfortable experience. We're focusing on those negative things. But the reason it does that is it thinks it's being really protective. So I like to think of anxiety kind of like a helicopter parent or like a caregiver or guardian, if you're familiar with that term, but someone that kind of hovers over their children or who's
watching
in their
you
care.
Constantly.
Yeah. And it kind of wants to keep you a little bit in a bubble,
Absolutely.
right? It doesn't want you to get hurt. So it's thinking of all the possible terrible scenarios that can happen because it thinks, well, if I warn this person about these things, then it can be prevented in some way. Either the person can plan for it or they can avoid those situations so they don't have to deal with any sort of fallout. So it's an interesting way to look at it, because for a lot of us, we just see the negative part or the uncomfortable part, but actually anxiety at its simplest form is just there to protect us.
I find that to be true as well. I feel like anxiety, most cases, puts us in a situation where we have to think twice, right?
Yes.
And then most of the times when we do have to think twice, it's usually for a good reason, right? It keeps us in check, if you want to say that.
100%. I love that. And you know what, Eddie? Another part of anxiety is that it often makes us prepare for things.
Mhm.
So if I'm having these what ifs, like what if I fail my exam? That's going to actually motivate me to study for my exam or take some time to review my notes or make sure that I know my stuff. So it's not all bad. Sometimes it can be really motivating. And you're right. It makes us think twice about some things in our lives and be like, is that a good idea? Maybe I should think about it more.
So what I'm getting from this is, I guess you can use anxieties as a good and bad, depending on where it's coming from, right?
Yeah.
That kind of brings me up to my second question. How do you know if your anxiety is at risk, or if you have you're going towards a negative anxiety?
That's a great question. So, as we kind of said at the beginning, we're all going to experience anxiety on some levels. That's part of being human. I like to think of anxiety as kind of on a spectrum. So, on one side, we have worry. And then on the other side, we have more of the panic. So often for many of us, we will experience anxiety as those worried thoughts. We might experience some physical symptoms as well. Maybe our heart races or we start to get shaky or sweaty, that kind of stuff. When it starts to get into the more extreme end, or what we call the disordered anxiety, and I say disordered because I'm not a fan of the term. However,
Yeah.
that's the clinical term, is when we feel like it's taking over our lives. So if at any point it feels like anxiety is kind of calling the shots all the time, or we start to avoid doing things that are really important to us out of fear that we might experience anxiety, that's when we're really on that maybe extreme end that we might want to get some support for.
So, most cases, if you start having more panic attacks, then you can control those type of things.
Yeah, it's interesting, Eddie, because panic attacks in themselves, we know that they are harmless in a sense that they won't cause any long-term damage. Of course, they are incredibly uncomfortable. Don't get me wrong. That experience in itself can be really fearful. But we know panic attacks in themselves are not dangerous in any way. However, if we start to experience a lot of them to the point that we can't do things, we can't go through our day without experiencing them to some extreme, then I would say, yeah, I'd get some support with that for sure.
Okay. Actually, speaking of support, why do you think more people don't seek out support when they get to that point? Or do you think you need to get support prior to getting there? Where should someone start seeking support?
That's a great question. I always say the sooner the better. Ideally, if we can learn these tools ahead of time, if we can learn some of these coping strategies beforehand, it's going to set us up really nicely if we ever get to that extreme end. So this is really helpful if you notice that anxiety is kind of coming in and we're struggling with dealing with it. I say as soon as you notice that, seek support then. If we wait, there's certainly things that can be done at that point too, but the sooner we can learn those skills and tools, the better.
Okay. I agree with that. Thanks for sharing that with me.
Yeah.
Now, for like personal experience, I know a few friends that have suffered from anxiety in the past. And what I've noticed from them is they started avoiding people, essentially, right? So they don't come out as much in fear of something going wrong or something not going according to what they had planned. So what's your experience on that stuff?
Yeah, 100%. So I believe we'll talk about maybe this more in video too, but when it comes to anxiety and avoidance, they're kind of BFFs. I like to say they're best friends for life. Because often what happens is we might go into a situation and experience anxiety. And because that anxiety is so uncomfortable, for a lot of us, it makes sense that we'd probably want to avoid a situation that makes us feel uncomfortable again. So for example, Eddie, if you were to touch a hot stove and you were to get burned, would you do it again?
No.
No, right? And this is how a lot of kids learn is they trial and error. They'll do something, they'll get maybe burnt, or they'll hurt themselves in some way, and they're like, oh, I'll never do that again. Anxiety works the same way, but it's kind of an emotional internal experience. If we experience something that makes us feel uncomfortable, naturally, we're not going to want to do that thing again. However, in the case of anxiety, what we find is that often increases our anxiety when we go into a similar situation again. So, for example, if we're fearful, in the case of your friend, of a social situation, if we experience anxiety once in that situation and then we're asked to go into it again, we might be fearful that anxiety is going to come on again. However, by avoiding the situation, it often increases it over time. So we say in the case of anxiety, avoidance is a short-term solution, but often is not helpful long-term because it does, in fact, exacerbate or promote anxiety.
I can agree with that. There was actually something I seen on one of these Instagram reels where it kind of put it into perspective for me, because again, I had no personal experience with anxiety like that. So when I seen it, it was just a little sketch of two people, and then one of the people in the sketch was saying, put your hand on the stove, right? And the person's like, yes, I can put my hand on the stove. And then they turned it on. And then they said, okay, now put your hand on the stove now. And the person says, no. So the person with anxiety says, okay, why don't you want to put your hand on the stove? It's easy. Just put your hand on the stove. And the person's like, no, it's going to burn me. But how do you know it's going to burn you? Because he's experienced it before and he doesn't want to experience it again, right? So it doesn't take a lot of talent to know that if I put my hand on the stove, it's going to burn me. As easy as it seems to do, all you need to do is just put your hand on the stove, but obviously it's going to hurt you, or you have a prior feeling of it hurting you at some point in your life, or whatever that case may be. So you choose not to do it because you want to protect yourself. So for me, that kind of made it explained it to me a lot more, because now I understand what they're going through.
100%. And I appreciate that perspective so much. I think for a lot of us looking in from the outside, it does seem simple, like just do it anyways. I mean, it's an uncomfortable experience, but whatever, you'll get over it. But for a lot of us, that's not the case. When we're feeling anxious, it does feel very fear-inducing and scary. And it can be a situation that feels like we can't go through that again. But what we know about anxiety treatment is we actually want people to go towards those things that they're fearful of, which initially we get a lot of pushback from clients and people seeking support because of that feeling. But the hope is by going towards those things that we're fearful of, we will learn that they actually aren't that scary. We can handle that feeling that comes with them.
Okay. Now, as a friend of a person who suffers from anxiety, how do you approach the person? Because not everybody wants to be reminded of their issues or their problems, right? So how do you gently say, hey, you know what? I feel like this could help you, or do you want to try this? How do you approach it without, lack of better words, insulting them or making them feel insulted or pressured,
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think there's a lot of reasons why people don't seek out support. One, of course, still being stigma around mental health and how it shows up. I think if we approach it from a place of love and support, that is often the best way to do it. But normalizing the experience can be helpful too, to say, hey, you know what, I notice for you anxiety is showing up a lot. Perhaps it would be helpful to, seek some support, or maybe I could help you find some support if that's something you're interested in doing. It can be challenging when our friends and family members aren't open to support, and sometimes that happens. In that case, we have to be patient and loving and be warm with that person as much as possible, and hopefully they'll come around to seeking support themselves.
I'd actually like to know how someone having anxiety impacts their family. Yeah, because we talk about I don't want to say patient, but the person experiencing the anxiety a lot, but we don't talk about the other side, where how your actions affect the people that love you, right? That want to, and trying so hard to put help in front of you, but you constantly refuse, type of thing, how it makes them feel. I'd like to know.
Yeah, of course. And as we were saying in the previous question, I think there is a lot of stigma around getting help and support, and some people aren't open to that for many different reasons. And so it can be really taxing on family or loved ones or friends that are there for that person and supporting that person. What I would say, of course, is anything that you're feeling in terms of frustration or sadness for that person makes perfect sense in that context. And so I would say those are feelings that you have to explore as a caregiver or a support in those situations. I think it's also important to remember that the person that is experiencing anxiety is not making this up. They're not faking it. They're not trying to be the center of attention. They're not trying to do this because they want the spotlight. All of those common things that we hear from people around people experiencing anxiety, those things are not true. This person is dealing with something that is outside of their control right now. And so as a caregiver or a loved one or a supporter, we just need to understand that this is not their fault, and to be patient with them. But every feeling that you have as a caregiver, if we're feeling frustrated or sad for that person, is a valid emotion. And I encourage you as a caregiver or a friend or support to seek support yourself, and how maybe you can be there for that person while also maintaining your own mental health and well-being, which is important too. We don't want you to sacrifice yourself in that sense. So it might be helpful to work with a professional to go through and sort of validate those feelings that you're experiencing and normalize the experience for you.
Yeah, I actually agree with that a lot. I think it's kind of like the trap that you fall into, trying to help a loved one because you care so deeply about them, right? And you're doing everything in your power to give them attention and give them help. And from their end, they might not be ready for it,
Yes.
So a lot of times you're continuously trying to push and push and push and push. Maybe sometimes you also need to find professional help and say, hey, you know what? I've done my best. Know when to find someone else, right? And say, hey, you know what? I have this situation. It's tasking on me. How can I help myself? Like, how can I help them? Almost and you can't do everything by yourself.
100%. I think it's all about recognizing your boundaries and knowing that, for the majority of people listening or watching they're not mental health professionals, right? So the expectation is not that you're going to fix that person or solve that person's issues. It's helping them seek support or find support in those moments. And you're right, they might not be ready initially, and we have to be patient with that. But it is important to remember that it is not your job to take someone else's anxiety away.
Absolutely. And I think because like I said before, initially when I first started hearing about anxiety and, growing up the way I grew up, it's get it done, nobody cares, right? There's no compassion. It's results over everything. So when you grow up like that and you see someone kind of in their feelings and not really wanting to get up and go, it's a little weird, because you're like, if I can do it, why can't you? Right? But we're not the same people. You have to understand that. So that's the other piece to it. I feel like a lot of times we compare ourselves to everybody and feel everybody should feel the way we feel. And on the other end of it, people who do suffer from anxiety also have to kind of, I don't know how much control they may have, but they have to understand, you know what, this person might not feel what I'm feeling right now. So let me be a little bit patient. I don't know how that would work. Maybe you want to speak on that?
Well, you're right. And I think the patience goes both ways, right? People often don't understand anxiety, which is why I'm so thankful we're having this conversation, so that maybe it does provide sort of a source or a light for people that have never experienced it. Because, you know, one of the most common things people with anxiety hear is, you know, calm down, it's okay, just relax. You know, we know that piece of advice is not helpful. If it was that easy, people with anxiety, I'm certain, would do that, right? So you're right that there has to be patience on both ends. The individual experiencing anxiety has to understand that some people might not know what that feels like, or might not have experienced it to the level that they're experiencing. And so as difficult as it is, part of their journey might be to educate other people about their experience. And hopefully the person on the other end, the receiving end of that, will be receptive.
When someone reaches out to you and they tell you, you know what, I'm suffering from anxiety. Now, speaking to them and understanding where they're coming from, you kind of know what level they're at, whether it's, you know what, I'm just starting to feel it, or I've been having anxiety for years, or you know what, I just can't take it anymore, right? Where do you see the best conversations, and where you're able to bring them back and help themselves?
Okay, sure. You know, and that's a great question, because I think everyone's curious about that. In terms of bringing them back, as in, well, let me clarify, because I think this is an important piece to clarify. When people first come to therapy, especially people that are dealing with anxiety, their first thought is, I want to make anxiety go away. I want to get rid of it. And when they come into session with that thought or that mindset, they are always going to fail. And the reason why is because anxiety is an emotion. We can't simply turn off an emotion. It'd be so nice if we had the power to do that. And if you figure it out, Eddie, let me know, because
I'll let you know
make
for sure.
millions and millions of dollars. But we don't have the capacity to do that. If we turn off an emotion, what often happens is all emotions get turned off, and then we become numb. And we certainly don't want someone to be numb, because they don't experience anything, not even joy. And that doesn't feel great, right? So when people come to session, their first thought always is, I want to get rid of it. It's uncomfortable. I just want to avoid. I don't want to deal with this. Makes sense, because we know it's such a terrible feeling. Often it is really uncomfortable, and it is a fear-inducing experience. So when people get here, the first thing we need to always work on is changing that mindset to say, you know what, anxiety is not going to go away. It is part of being human. You're going to experience that, Eddie. I'm going to experience it. This is just a fact of life. What we want to be able to do then is to teach skills and coping strategies so that a person can experience anxiety, but can get through it successfully without feeling the need to shut down, without feeling the need to avoid those things that are important to them. So essentially being able to experience anxiety and move through it without having to make their world smaller in any way. So that's kind of where I work from. That means at any stage, whether you're just initially experiencing anxiety or if you've experienced it for many, many years, you can essentially work through it. Often what I would say is, if we can catch you earlier on and provide you with these tools earlier on, that's always a great place to be. However, if you've experienced this for a lot of years, we can still work with that. It just might take us a little bit longer to work through that mindset shift, but we can still do that work successfully.
Okay, that's a good point. Now, is there ever a time where some people who are more independent than others, who started experiencing high anxiety, is it ever okay to try and deal with it on your own, or is it 100% try to find help?
Yeah, and that's a great question. So again, if we're looking at anxiety on a spectrum, if we're experiencing worry, it depends on how intense that worry is. If it's keeping you up at night, if it's changing your day-to-day routine, if we're seeing that you're missing out on things that are important to you, or, you're starting to isolate yourself, that's when I would say, you know what, this is kind of a red flag popping up. This might be time to seek support. If we're dealing with everyday anxiety that feels manageable in a sense, we don't feel overwhelmed by it, we're able to move through it, then I would say it's probably okay to work through that on your own. Maybe with some coping strategies, you certainly could get through it on your own.
That's good to know. Now, who essentially is at risk for anxiety? I know you say it's on a spectrum, but so who is at risk? Who is at risk? It's a broad question, but you might have an answer for it.
That is a great question. So as I mentioned, we're all going to experience anxiety on some level because it is a spectrum. You're absolutely right, Eddie. Those who are at risk of what we call the disordered end of anxiety are often genetically predispositioned to it. So what we say is often genetic disorders run in families. So we might have anxious parents, we might have anxious brothers or sisters, perhaps we have anxious family members in our past or are currently in our family. We tend to see anxiety passed down through generations. So this is a really common thread that we see. The other thing is we often see anxiety, and I know we're going to talk about this later in a different video, but anxiety linked to things like perfectionism is really common. So if we have kind of that perfectionist type of personality where it's either we're total failures or we're totally successful, we're going to notice that anxiety increases in those populations as well. So people that tend to want things to be perfect all the time, you might experience more anxiety.
So somewhat like OCD characteristics, those type of things.
So OCD is a form. It is what we call an anxiety disorder. So it would be considered as part of that spectrum, maybe on the more extreme end of the spectrum.
I mean, I feel like people say the word OCD in such a general phase. And I think I'm OCD because there's certain things that I like in certain orders and blah, blah, blah. But a lot of times, if it really doesn't go in that order, it bothers me a little bit, but I can kind of push it off. But I know quite a few people who, if it really isn't in that order, oh my goodness, their world is done, right? Yeah, so I get what you're saying.
100%. And we have to be careful with that because it has become almost like for lack of better words, a joke that we say, like, oh, I'm OCD. But for those who experience OCD, it is a very scary and very serious thing. So we have to be really careful about the language we use when we're speaking of these experiences and these disorders. OCD in itself, there are many different forms of it. It shows up very differently for different people. But there are rituals and there is this impulsive kind of sense that comes with it and some intrusive thoughts that feel overwhelming. That stuff is very serious. So I know sometimes we like to joke and say, oh, I like to keep things clean. I'm so OCD. But that actually
it means something to somebody.
Yeah, and that can be very harmful in how we use that. So we have to just be really careful about how we use the term and make sure that we really understand what we're saying when we say that.
No, thanks for that. I mean, for me, I'm guilty of using it a lot. I feel like it's just become such a normalized thing to say or do. And even on the other end, where if somebody has some kind of disorder, you just say the disorder as if it was just nonchalant when it's really not, right? So I appreciate you saying how we have to be respectful in the language we use to ourselves or to anybody in public, right? It's very, it could cause something that you don't know to somebody, right? And it's just something that's normal for you.
Yeah, yeah. And on that line, for a lot of us, we tend to say, oh, we're feeling anxious. But oftentimes what we're experiencing isn't actually, in fact, anxiety. So anxiety is very specific in that it's future-based, but it's different than fear. Fear is present-based. So Eddie, if you and I went on a hike together and we saw a grizzly bear as we were hiking, I don't know about you, but I would probably be I'd probably be a little worried.
Absolutely.
I would maybe push you over and hope to run faster than you. But the idea is, if we were to go hiking and we saw a grizzly bear in that moment, what we would be experiencing is fear.
Mm-hmm.
But if you and I decided, okay, next week we're going to go on a hike, and while we're hiking, I'm like, Eddie, what if we see a bear? Like, what if it pops out of nowhere? What if we see a grizzly bear? Like, what if there's cubs? What do we do? That is anxiety. So slightly different terms, but we tend to use them interchangeably. So this is why our language is so important when we're discussing things like anxiety or fear or OCD or other conditions. Really important that we know what we're speaking of when we use the term.
I know that's good. I feel like these kind of videos and interactive situations will help a lot of people, because even for me, like I said, I'm not in the world, so sometimes I might say this just nonchalantly or generalizing a statement, but it's very important that we respect our peers, the people around us that are actually in fact going through these things on a daily basis, So I appreciate what you were saying on that for sure.
100%. Now, do you want me, Eddie, to explain a little bit more about how anxiety works?
Yes.
Okay, so let's get to the nuts and bolts, as they say. Anxiety, essentially, if we're looking at it internally in our brains and how it works, is it sounds an alarm system in our body. Mm-hmm. So there's this really tiny piece of our brain called the amygdala. And it's actually the size of your thumbnail, like no lie, it's very tiny. Mm-hmm. And what it does is anytime it senses worry or anxiety or fear, if it's present, it is going to sound this alarm system. So I like to compare it almost to a fire alarm. If a fire alarm goes off, we are ready to either vacate or hide or do something. And this is the same as our amygdala. When it sounds, we go into that fight, flight, freeze, or fawn response. So essentially, we are getting ready to take some sort of action, whether that's to get smaller, whether that's to fight or run away. Mm-hmm. Now, the problem with that, Eddie, is because we are going into the fight, flight, freeze mode. That is a part of our nervous system that we are not in control over. And this is why, when we talk about people with anxiety, they're not in control of what happens when they're feeling anxious most of the time. They are in this space of fight, flight, freeze, and they are running on adrenaline at that point. And this is why we often feel a lot of physical symptoms at that point. When our adrenaline shoots up and we're getting ready to fight something or run away or freeze, we need to make sure that we have the resources to do those things. So this is why sometimes we might get flushed or turn red. It's because our blood is moving to our surface. And our muscles. We might notice we get shaky because we got the shot of adrenaline pumping through us. We might notice our heart's pounding a little bit more. We're just getting ready to take action. We might even notice that we start to get dizzy or maybe a headache from that shot of adrenaline. All of those responses are really common. Now, our brains are really old school. So they respond the same way to an exam as they would a grizzly bear. And this is why it's really tricky, because if you go into an exam and you're responding the same way you would to a grizzly bear, even though it's just a piece of paper, we're going to have some struggles there. And what happens when that amygdala sounds the alarm is all of our energy from our prefrontal cortex right here in our brain, that spot is responsible for reasoning and problem solving. All of that energy is now going to our amygdala. So this is why for a lot of people, when they're experiencing anxiety in that moment, it's really hard to problem solve or think rationally. This might show up on an exam. For example, you study really hard and then you get to an exam and you feel anxious and then you forget everything you've studied.
Yeah.
This is really common. Yeah, you go blank. And that's because all that energy from your prefrontal cortex has moved to the amygdala. So our job is to essentially just turn down the volume on the amygdala or the anxiety response so that we can send energy back to our prefrontal cortex so we can start reasoning and problem solving again. But that is essentially how it works in a nutshell.
That's pretty neat. I actually never thought of it that way. I just equated it to like the fight or flight situations, and it's do or don't, right? You just freeze up. So no, that's very good. I appreciate that. Yeah, what would be the common symptoms of anxiety? Because I feel like it could be skewed, right? Just like you were talking about the grizzly bear and the future-based planning thing. A lot of people might not really know the difference. So if you're feeling one way, you might think, oh, I'm anxious, but you're feeling another thing and you're like, oh, maybe I'm just scared of whatever it is. So yeah, symptoms might be a great way to go.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So the interesting thing is for many of us, fear, anxiety, and excitement actually show up the same. We attribute excitement to be a positive emotion. So we often feel good about that response, even though it mimics or it feels very similar to an anxiety or fear response. So that's a really interesting thought, is that just our mindset about the two are very different. But when it comes to anxiety, it comes with thoughts, feelings, and sensations. Those are kind of the three. So our thoughts, I know I had mentioned this earlier, are the what ifs. These can be very future-based. They can be very scary. Like it can be extreme to the point of like, what if I hurt another person? Or it can be as simple as, what if I forget my lunch tomorrow, right? So very different types of thoughts, but they all kind of start with this similar theme of what if. When it comes to feelings or emotions, anxiety can bring on a whole bunch of feelings and emotions, fear and panic being one of those. But it's not uncommon for people to feel sad when anxiety shows up, or overwhelmed when anxiety shows up. Those are really common feelings as well. And then in terms of sensations, we got often our heart might start beating fast. We got sort of that sweaty feeling. Maybe we start to feel kind of clammy. We might feel flushed in our face. We might get headaches. We might feel dizzy. Dizziness is really common. We might feel those butterflies in our stomach. Two really common feelings are depersonalization and derealization. And these essentially feel like we're disconnected from either ourselves or an environment. So it might feel like we're kind of in a dream state, kind of feels like things aren't real, or we might feel disconnected from ourselves, like it's almost that out-of-body kind of experience. So those are really common experiences as well. Now, all of these things obviously lead to behavior, which is interesting, because when we feel these things, we might behave differently depending on what we're experiencing. And avoidance, as we mentioned, is often our number one behavior that we see as a result.
Now, speaking of that, feeling anxiety and then getting into the sad state and all that stuff, how quick that would lead me to believe it would lead to depression almost, right? So you're kind of keeping to yourself. You're not really wanting to be in public and feel other emotions that such as joy, those type of stuff. So wouldn't that lead to depression?
100%. I appreciate that you put those two together, Eddie, because they are often BFFs too, depression and anxiety. So often what we find is if anxiety is not managed well, if we're not sure how to manage our anxiety, it can lead to depression. The really cool thing about the two is often if we support anxiety, we can also help depression. So if you find that you're feeling depressed because you are experiencing anxiety, I encourage you to reach out for support as soon as you can. And that way you can start to work on both together.
Thanks for that. People wanted to reach you. Where can they reach you?
Yeah, so I have a website. It's pineappletherapy.ca. They're welcome to pop on there, and they can connect with me that way, or they can send me an email, Kayla@pineappletherapy.ca, or they can find me on Instagram. Pineapple Therapy YEG is my handle.